Okay, we're here at the 6th International Conference on Community-based Adaptation in Hanoi, Vietnam. Delighted to be joined by Saleemul Huq. Saleem, what are we hoping to achieve here this week?
Well, we're hoping to get together well over 200, probably 250 plus people from all over the world. Just over 100 of them came 3 days ago, and they just spent 3 days in the field, and they've come back, and another 100 plus have arrived today. The conference itself starts tomorrow morning, and it'll go on for the next 3.5 days. And the theme this year is on communicating community-based adaptation. So we're trying to use as many different channels of communication, from social media, tweeting and blogging, and traditional media. We have a number of journalists from around the world coming and covering it this time, and webcasting it through you guys. So we're hoping that we'll get a lot more coverage this year than we have in the past.
And what are you expecting people to learn this week? What are you hoping people will come out of this conference with?
Well, I think the two things. Firstly, the fact that there's so much happening on the ground. One of the things that I see happening, particularly in the developed countries, is a lack of realization or awareness of how much is happening on the ground in developing countries, how much vulnerable communities and people working with vulnerable communities are actually doing to build their capacity to deal with climate change, which is now called community-based adaptation. And we started with maybe a few dozen examples a few years ago. Now there are hundreds of them going on all over the world. So it's an opportunity to share what people are doing with each other across the world and draw some lessons out. What are we learning out of that process?
And you mentioned there that there's a lot more of this going on now, that community-based adaptation is a much bigger deal than it was. This is the 6th of these conferences, of course. What other lessons and what else has changed over the course of these events?
Well, I'd say it's several things. Firstly, the number of people engaged in the processes around the world have grown enormously. Started off with maybe a dozen or so examples. When we first started, we had maybe 40 or 50 people come to the first event. Since then, we now have almost 300 coming to the 6th event, and there are hundreds of examples. At the same time, we've been going up a very steep learning curve in terms of figuring out what is community-based adaptation, how is it different from community-based development generally, or even disaster risk reduction, which has been going on for much longer. And we're beginning to come up with some answers to those questions in a variety of different settings, and part of the exercise is to learn about community-based adaptation to climate change and what makes it different from other kinds of activities.
And this conference is going to be focusing especially on communication. To what extent have these issues been communicated effectively in the past? Where is there room for improvement, do you think?
I think communications has been a weak point in the past. We've had a group of people who are interested in it, who've come together through the conferences, but they've been in the few hundreds. What we want to do is to expand that to the thousands of people. One good thing about this particular meeting is that we've had a lot of interest from lots of people who would have liked to have been here but couldn't be here. So what we're trying to do is to provide them information in real time every day on what happens here through the webcast, some live, some recorded, but every day updating information on the internet so people can follow what's happening here and learn much more about it.
And is this an issue which is animating mainstream policymakers yet? Is this an issue that is really getting the attention where it needs to be had?
I wouldn't say we've achieved that yet. I think we're in the process of making the case that it has to be done. And in fact, one of the options or suggestions for next year's 7th conference is mainstreaming international policy. So far, what I think we've been able to achieve is a very strong engagement from civil society, from NGOs who work with vulnerable communities who've really taken up this issue quite seriously. In the last year or two, we've had more engagement from academia, from researchers who are interested in learning lessons. The conference we held last year in Bangladesh, for example, the 5th one, focused on learning lessons for scaling up, and we have a book coming out of that, which we hope will be citable by the IPCC 5th Assessment Report. So we focused on learning lessons. Now we're focusing on communicating more widely, getting more people to know about these things, because I don't think the wider public, particularly in the developed world, is as aware of these things happening around the world as many people. More people in developing countries are aware of them, but less so in developed countries.
And what would your vision be for the future then in 6 conferences' time? Where do you hope we're at?
Well, we're hoping that adaptation to climate change gets recognized as a major response option to climate change around the world. That is happening. Even developed countries are now realizing they're going to have to adapt, and they're developing adaptation plans. Where the other part of that is that the most vulnerable communities themselves can play a proactive role. They don't have to be victims, they don't have to be recipients of aid. They can actually be the agents of their own capacity building and adapting to climate change. And that's beginning to happen here. And so my ambition is to make that lesson and message go across policymakers at national and international level, and for them to recognize that and to support the efforts that are happening to be able to multiply them all over the world.
And for people who want to follow that journey this week, how can they tune in?
Well, we have a dedicated channel on the IID website. That's iid.org. We have Your One Climate, One World. We've got a YouTube channel for CBA. We're tweeting out of here, we're blogging out of here. So look for all the possible channels that CBA6 will be coming through. And I'm sure that people will be able to follow. We'll update it on a regular daily basis. We're actually going to do a few live webcasts as well from Hanoi, so people can ask questions and have people from the meeting answer them.
Saleemul Huq, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to catching up with you throughout the week.